Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pauline letters. And today we have moved to the south side of Chicago, home of the White Sox, in the ballpark now known as Guaranteed Rate Field. In point of fact, most of us still just call it New Comiskey because we don't get paid to abide by corporate sponsorships. But that's another conversation. Anyhow, we are here to talk about St. Paul's letter to the Romans, the subject of our next 3 classes. And it's fitting that we do it here at the home of the exploding scoreboard, because Romans, more than any other book of the Pauline corpus, tends to make people's heads explode. It's very abstract, very comprehensive in its approach to articulating the mystery of faith. We'll delve into that in these next 3 classes. This first class is going to be introductory in character, so let's go ahead and look at our agenda for the day. First, we're going to talk about St. Paul and how he came to know the city of Rome, how he came to form a relationship with the Roman Church. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the character of this Roman Church, Gentiles and Jews, and what happened before Paul even corresponded with them. And then finally, we'll spend some time taking a synchronic survey, an outline of the entire 16-chapter letter. First, we mostly think of Paul in the city of Rome because of things that happened well after Romans was written. Paul, of course, is famous for St. Paul's Basilica outside the walls. He's famous for being one of the twin apostles with St. Peter, who was martyred in Rome. But all of that happened later. We read in Acts 28, verse 14 and 16, that Paul, along with his companions, entered the city of Rome and that he was allowed to live by himself with the soldier who was guarding him. But all of that happened well after the letter to the Romans was written. Paul wrote the letter to the Romans during his 3rd missionary journey. Indeed, we can infer this from a few of the key details present in the letter itself. For example, in Romans chapter 15, St. Paul's talking about the collection, that same collection that he was talking about in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, appealing to the Corinthians to give generously. In Romans 15, we find out that it's been successful. He writes, "For Macedonia and Achaia," remember, Achaia is that southern portion of Greece where Corinth is, "have decided to make some contribution for the poor among the holy ones in Jerusalem. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to serve them in material blessings." So Paul, by this point, has gone to Corinth, he's gone to Achaia, and has received the generosity of the Corinthian Christians toward his collection. So we know that Paul is writing this either in Corinth or thereafter. The decisive fact comes a little bit later in chapter 16 when Paul commends Phoebe, who's a servant of the church, a minister of the church at Cenchrea, which is the port city for Corinth. So Paul is writing this letter towards the end of his 3rd missionary journey from Corinth. One other important detail about Romans is that Paul writes this letter to a church he has not yet visited. Unlike Thessalonians, unlike Corinthians, unlike Galatians, unlike Philippians and the other letters, which Paul wrote to churches that he had either founded or at least had spent a significant period of time in, Paul writes Romans to a church he had not visited. He neither founded nor had yet visited the Roman church. Indeed, Paul says, "I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I often planned to come to you, though I was prevented until now, that I might harvest some fruit among you too, as among the rest of the Gentiles." And I want you to notice 2 details. One is that he still calls the Roman Christians brothers. Even though he does not know them, he recognizes their common baptism and their common identity in participating in the sonship of Christ. But he also says, "as among the rest of the Gentiles." And this implies that the Roman church is more Gentile than Jewish. And this is significant. This detail is significant when we look at the history of the Roman church. A few years before this, so in AD 49, Emperor Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. While we're not quite sure about all the details, it's possible that that edict resulted from the debate and perhaps some fighting between Jewish Christians and Jewish non-Christians, arguing over whether this Jesus was in fact the Messiah. So the Roman church would have been founded before then. There's all sorts of scholarly debate about the details here, but this is at least a plausible scenario. So the Roman church by the time that Paul is writing to it late in the 50s during his third missionary journey, would have been more Gentile than Jewish. So this gives us a little bit of an insight as to why Paul wants to form this relationship with the Roman church. It's a Gentile church, and he is the apostle to the Gentiles. Indeed, Paul plays up that identity. Indeed, you can see here in Romans chapter 1, this is incidentally part of a very long Greek sentence. The first 7 verses of Romans are all one sentence in the Greek. The New American Bible punctuates it into a few different sentences just so that way it's easier for us to digest in English. Here are verses 5 and 6. Through him we have received the grace of apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the Gentiles, among whom are you also, who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. So here Paul plays up his role as apostle to the Gentiles, that he is uniquely consecrated by the Lord to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles, to bring them to what he calls the obedience of faith. That's a key theme, obedience of faith. The word obedience occurs several times in Romans. You can see them on your screen here. And notice how the 5th verse of the entire letter talks about the obedience of faith. And at the very end of the letter, in chapter 16, verse 26, Paul is once again going to reprise this theme of the obedience of faith. For Paul, obedience and faith fit hand in glove with one another. So Paul writes Romans as the apostle to the Gentiles, to a predominantly Gentile church at the heart of the empire. That's another motive for Paul wanting to reach Rome. Paul wants to preach the gospel in the center of the empire, Rome, the most important city in the Mediterranean world at that time. With that, let's move on to our synchronic survey. Starting with the epistolary elements, we see that Paul is the sole named sender of Romans. Paul's going to drop lots of names in chapters 15 and 16. Paul has associates that he's with, but he writes in his own name alone to the Romans. The addressees, all the beloved of God in Rome. So it's a mixed church, but it's a predominantly Gentile church for the reasons we've just spoken about. The occasion, like we said, Paul is writing to the center of the empire toward the end of his third missionary journey. He's writing to achieve a certain rapport with the church and to share with them the basics of his gospel. And the message, one commentator suggests that Paul writes with 3 purposes. Missionary, he's trying to form this relationship with this other church. Apologetic, trying to defend against possible accusations that might have reached the Roman Christians. Keep in mind, he's dealt with the problems in Galatia as well as the problems with the super apostles in Corinth, as well as just pastoral. He's trying to give them advice as a church for how to live. Our outline of Romans, this comes from Antonio Pita's commentary in Italian, so this is translated into English. But the main body of the letter is the second half of chapter 1 all the way through the middle of chapter 15. There's a lengthy conclusion, and there's also a very lengthy introduction by Paul's terms. You've got this first sentence, which goes for 7 verses. There's an exordium that goes from verses 8 through 15. But the propositio generalis is one that we're going to delve into in our next class, where Paul is going to talk about how he is not ashamed of the gospel and how he is proud to proclaim it, and he articulates it through the main body of the letter. Notice that there are 2 main sections. From the middle of chapter 1 all the way through chapter 11, which Pita terms the demonstrative section. That is demonstrative rhetoric describing what are our values as Christians. Who are we as Christians, and how does this make us different from the world around us? There's also going to be a paraklesis later in the letter. There's going to be a section with deliberative rhetoric where Paul is telling the Roman Christians how to live the Christian life. So we have a lot to talk about in our next 2 classes, where we will go in greater detail with these 16 chapters of Romans. Until then, read well and pray well.